Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Dog Backwards, where we look at life, faith, and theology from a different angle. I told you on the last one, we were going to have a really, I would say it's not unique for this podcast because that kind of seems in the vein of what we were going to talk about, anyways, around here. We like to look at things that might not be covered by the church in general, but I know a lot of people have questions about. We are going to talk about psychedelics, mushrooms, acid, DMT, the whole range, and how that applies to the supernatural world that Christians by default believe in. And is it good? Is it safe? Is it healthy? What about medicinal purposes? How do we figure this stuff out? Well, luckily, we have a lady by the name of Ashley Land. And I said it wrong, right?
It's
Landy.
fine. Don't
Yeah.
worry about it. Yeah.
I'm just going to call you Ashley.
Okay.
Last names throw me off. And she wrote this really fascinating article on the subject that kind of detailed her experience through this journey of dealing with mainly acid, but other psychedelics and just the whole new age movement and how she went from that to a relationship with Jesus Christ. So, Ashley, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm thrilled to be here.
We're really lucky to have you. And when I reached out to you, I told you just a small glimpse of kind of my own past, but I haven't always been a Christian, and I considered myself a quote unquote atheist for a while. And without God, I could do whatever I wanted. So I have not probably not as much as you do, but I have some experience with psychedelics. And your article made me kind of start thinking back again and asking some questions about the experiences that I had. And I had never tried to put them in a Christian worldview. I just figured it was just messing with my brain, but maybe there's
Yeah.
something more supernatural to that. So tell us, how did you get started into taking psychedelics and things like that?
Yeah. So I grew up kind of nominally Christian, I guess. I was raised going to a Methodist church here and there. It wasn't a huge part of our lives. I had a wonderful childhood in a lot of ways, but it was kind of easy for me once I was a teenager to I didn't really have a strong foundation in faith and didn't really ever feel like I fully understood who Jesus was or really knew him or had any kind of intimacy with him. So it was pretty easy when I was a teenager to just kind of write it off. And I started getting into I don't know, I guess you'd say countercultural things, reading books and listening to music that I probably had no business reading or listening to. But I was just fascinated by, this subculture and counterculture. And gosh, I probably tried marijuana, I think a couple times in high school, wasn't really that into it. And then in college, I got into drinking as a lifestyle. But toward the end of college, one of my friends happened to bring over some psilocybin mushrooms one night. It was my senior year of college, and I didn't really know very much about it. I read a little bit here and there, but I didn't know that much about it. But I thought, why not? And I took them and had a really, what I felt at the time was a very interesting experience. And I really enjoyed it, really liked it. But I was still an atheist. It really didn't, I don't know. It didn't seem spiritual to me at that point. And, but as I went on, gosh, probably a year later, I decided that it was time for me to be able to intellectually argue my atheism in a really effective way, to the extent that I was able. And so I started reading a lot of the new atheist literature and just felt like I was on this quest. And it's interesting looking back now, it was never about investigating the claims of Christianity or even the claims of any religion. For me, it was just foregone conclusion. There is no God. I'm going to be able, when I come up against someone who believes, I need to be able to, argue against them effectively. But anyway, around that time, I met a man who I was always asking people if they had mushrooms because I wanted to do it again. And I think in the intervening year, I think I did it once or twice. And anyway, I met this man that I was talking to, and he said, well, I don't have mushrooms, but I have LSD. And I said, oh, sure. Same thing, whatever. And, so he came over to my apartment. I was living in Kansas City at the time, and he came over, and looking back, it's just so incredibly reckless because he was more or less a stranger to me.
Right.
But we took LSD, and I had a very intense, and psychologically shattering experience. And it was after that that I really started to think maybe there was more than I had realized in the world. And I definitely wasn't a materialist atheist anymore after that. But that took me down a road of really idolizing psychedelics and LSD in particular. And part of that was it was just the most readily available one to me at that time. But I also loved it. I loved it and hated it, you know. And that, yeah, it took me down a road of all kinds of different various new age ideologies and Hinduism, Buddhism, just kind of a grab bag of anything except for Jesus. I was still very closed off to Jesus.
You know, if we would to like end your story there, it would sound very Joe Roganish, right? Like he
Yeah,
has really popularized the
yeah,
use of psychedelics. He has the largest audience of not just podcasts, but kind of information of anybody
mhm,
out there right now. And he very
yeah,
openly and freely talks about how great it is and
oh yeah,
ayahuasca and his guest. It's a regular discussion.
hmm,
So it does seem to be like there is this renaissance of the use of psychedelics, and people are much more interested now because it's becoming normalized.
yeah,
Now,
yeah, for sure.
in the 60s, it was very popular, especially like LSD. I never had a good experience on LSD. It was never
Yeah,
positive. Mushrooms,
yeah,
I don't know if it was. I wouldn't say they were good or bad. They were neutral.
mm,
They were interesting. I would say, like, I would see Buddha floating above a flame for six
okay,
hours, just things like that.
yeah,
But I never connected it to supernatural. I didn't think of it as a
mm,
supernatural experience. I was just like, this drug is going to do things to my brain and make me see things
okay,
that aren't
yeah.
there. Now, do you find that it is, people say it's a renaissance of psychedelics? Is that true? Is that somewhat related to the kind of popularity of Joe Rogan and things like that?
Oh, I think for sure. And I haven't listened. I know that about Joe Rogan. I don't listen to him a ton because I homeschool my kids and they're always with me and he cusses so much. But I have listened to clips here and there and it just astonishes me. He had who it was Michael Pollan, who you might have heard of, who wrote he's a journalist and he wrote a whole book called How to Change Your Mind. I think it was published in 2018. And I've read that a couple times in preparation for I'd read it previously and then I read it again in preparation for the podcast, and he's definitely biased. But on the Joe Rogan show, I watched a clip of him, and he said something about I think it was when he took DMT, and he said, it wasn't like all that. Michael Pollan was saying it wasn't all that was spectacular, and Joe Rogan just immediately was like, "Well, you didn't take enough.
Right.
You should take more. You
Yeah.
didn't take enough." And I was like, I just felt like this is so irresponsible, like telling people that. And I know he's a huge enthusiast and has all kinds. I think he's had Dennis McKenna on his show, who's Terrence McKenna's brother. um yeah, and all kinds of people like that. And I think there absolutely is a renaissance. And I think, I've thought about it a lot, obviously. It's interesting, this is not the direction that I thought God would take me, like in my writing and in my, I haven't taken psychedelics in, I think it's been 8 years, 9 years was the last time I grew my own mushrooms and
Yeah.
had a horrible time. And as I wrote about in the essay,
Yeah. In your article.
but to me, it was in the past. And for a long time too, I really didn't want to talk about it because I was just so traumatized and scarred by all of it. But yeah, I think there is a renaissance. And I think it's symptomatic of the fact that people are hungry for God, and we live in an increasingly secularized society, but people are still hungry for transcendence. And this is something that, it's ready made. Like you can take a substance and you will have what seems to be a spiritual experience, whether there's an authentic spiritual dimension or not, or it's a epiphenomena of our brain. I'm inclined to think that there is a legitimate spiritual dimension to it. Not a good one,
Right.
but that there is. Yeah.
When
Yeah.
I was talking, I just had Dr. Hugh Ross on, who's the
Yes.
astrophysicist, and we were
Uh-huh.
talking about
Yeah.
aliens. And his conclusion was that there are things that are real but not physical.
Mm.
And he cited all of this evidence that I was kind of blown away by.
Yeah.
And he was like, "Yeah, I would say it's real, but it's demonic." And
Yeah.
that's one of the things. And Lee Strobel and I were talking about heaven and near death experiences. And when
Yeah.
people die, the things they saw. And that's really kind of what got me going down this road, thinking about, when I did psychedelics, I never saw Jesus, but I would see
Yeah.
other deities
Yeah.
that have existed throughout time. I was
Right.
not Buddhist. I was not interested in Buddhism.
Yeah.
But why, when I take it, would I see this chubby fat guy, which I never understood why
Mhm.
somebody would learn self discipline from an overweight guy? Um, that's a dumb joke. But I always I started to remember, like, why was that part of my
Yeah.
experience?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
is there a supernatural, maybe not in the good sense, supernatural connection
Right.
when people take these things? They see colors maybe they might not have ever seen before. They see geometric
Yeah.
shapes.
Mhm.
Um, and math is kind of the language of science. So maybe that geometry, is it kind of a pulling apart of the veil and seeing a world that is around us that is there, but we aren't normally open to see?
I have struggled with this so much because I and certainly, I always want to be very careful about the way I speak about it because I never want to entice someone, obviously. Like ultimately it boils down to I think whether it opens one up to a spiritual dimension or not, which I'm inclined to think it does, it's not the prescribed way that God has given us to Him. Like God has given us Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And when my kids and I were just reading today, John 14 or 15, where Jesus talks about like anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate is a thief and a robber. And I've wondered about that, if that could be like in some way analogous to psychedelics. It's like we are accessing a spiritual realm. And I think even through meditation, which I was somewhat into meditation, I think there are real spiritual things that are going on. But I think ultimately what's so scary too about the psychedelic renaissance is that we are are so not in control of these experiences. Like they're so psychedelics are wildly variable. I could have the most fantastic trip of my life one weekend, and the next weekend I had the most hellish trip I've ever had that I was scarred from for weeks. And so I think they're very deceiving. um and they're very risky, and they're very dangerous, and there are people, as much as this new wave of psychedelic research has tried to minimize this, there are plenty of people who do not come back
Yeah.
from from using psychedelics.
It's
Yeah.
almost like the military term from like World War I, World War II is shell shocked. When somebody
Yeah.
sees something so awful, they never come back from it
Yeah.
mentally. And there are
Yeah.
people who are shell shocked from the
Hmm.
experiences they have on these drugs.
For sure.
And
Yeah.
it seems like we're curious people. And if someone
Yeah.
says, hey, all you got to do is take this, and we're
Right.
so conditioned just to take a pill for whatever problem.
Hmm.
And someone's
Yeah.
like, hey, if you're trying to see what the universe is all really about and discover the deep mystical truth, it's like a gateway to Gnosticism, right? Like there's some
Yeah.
secret knowledge that you don't have. And all you got to do is eat a mushroom. And people are like, well, we
Right.
eat mushrooms all the time. If you have
Right.
pizza, you eat a mushroom. And so it seems so easy, but
Yeah.
yet I can't think of anything biblically. I'm not even sure, and you might know more about this than I do. Were these kind of things present in Jerusalem or surrounding areas during the time of Jesus? Did Rome bring these in? Is this?
Mm. People try to make like it was just really interesting diving. And back in the day, I had so many books about psychedelics and LSD and mushrooms and different histories of them. And I ended up getting rid of almost all of those. But I kind of was like, darn, I did like was it Acts 19? I was like, I'm just gonna burn all this. I'm gonna get rid of it. And I was like, well, that would have been useful, to have that knowledge. But I just had to trust that God was gonna provide the knowledge I needed. But it's interesting. It seems like, there's nothing new under the sun. Like, I feel like it's gone even farther in people trying, as far as people trying to like justify or legitimize psychedelics by pointing to different things in history, suggesting like, oh, well, that must have been and I think I said this on Unbelievable, that it does become, and it became, I remember I was this way, it becomes this totalizing theory for people where they think,
Yes.
oh, like it must have, every religious impulse must have originated from psychedelics. So people point to the Eleusinian mystery cult of Greece. They say, oh, well, they must have been tripping, although nobody's ever been able to recreate this brew that this psychedelic brew that they supposedly had. And there's a book called The Mushroom and the Sacred Cross, I think by John Allegro, that was published in the 70s. And Brian Marescu, the guy who's he wrote The Immortality Key, which is kind of like a, recapitulation of all those theories that that even Christianity originated, or I don't know, I haven't read Brian Marescu's book. I think his thing might be that Christianity suppressed these like cults that use mushrooms, and suppressed this secret knowledge of but when you actually look at the anthropological evidence, like it really just isn't there. And there's even supposedly that really the only thing that anyone has found archaeologically that they try to tie to Judaism and Christianity is there was some like cannabis resin in a eighth century BC altars, somewhere in the Middle
Yeah.
East, and they try to say, but I mean that's so scant. Like, and I'm not a historian or archaeologist, but I would think like that would not be considered anywhere near sufficient to build this entire theory upon. Yet I feel like that's really what people try to do.
And we don't have any kind of like intertestamental writings that are
Right.
dealing with these kind of subjects, pro or
No.
con. Like it's just kind of silent
Yeah.
on it.
Yeah.
Now I'm inclined to believe that we're not the first people to discover pot. Like that's kind of probably been
Yeah.
around for a long time.
Sure. Yeah.
But there's a big leap from marijuana to LSD. It's a
Right.
large, psychoactive jump in what
Right.
happens from the taking of those. But I do know Joe Rogan mentioned, something that I think you've mentioned is people say, "Oh, the burning bush, he was on drugs."
Right.
And
Yeah.
sure, if one guy has an experience, I can see how people will use that, and they'll use psychedelics as kind of a big paintbrush just to cover all supernatural
Right.
experiences. Oh, they were
Yeah.
on drugs because it's
Yeah.
easy and it's convenient.
Right.
But when you have the disciples all have such similar experiences, it's not like they saw Jesus in the same way people saw Bigfoot, right? Like where
Right.
I just saw him out of
Yeah.
the corner of my eye and I was in the third realm and all this stuff. They're like, no,
Yeah.
we sat and we ate with them and you can go
Hmm.
talk to him too.
Yeah.
It's kind of a weak argument.
It
When it
is. And
comes,
we saw him eat. I always think
yeah,
that that detail
yeah,
is so fascinating to
yeah,
me, and to me it points to the veracity, because it's like, why would you make that up? It's such a
right.
bizarre thing to, yeah, it's just, yeah.
Now, the conversation, and we've had this on our podcast a long time ago. We had a Christian doctor come on and talk about the medical benefits of marijuana.
Mhm.
And Oklahoma is per capita one of the largest areas for dispensaries. I
Oh,
mean, we have
really?
more
Okay. I didn't know
dispensaries than
that.
gas stations on a street now. Like it is just
Wow.
exploded here.
Yeah.
Um, and so we had conversations about, is this helpful? Is it not? And my personal belief is that it can be medically useful, but
Mm.
most people lack the self-control. I don't think anything should be smoked or anything like that because there's no way to control your dosage. But if there's oils or something that you can control your doses to deal with, maybe either it's trauma, PTSD, or a temporary relief of anxiety so that you can work through it, I don't think any of that stuff's good long term.
Yeah.
I think it is an option
Mm.
if you and your physician get together and decide that it's better for you than some other kind of antidepressant. But when it comes to psychedelics, I'm thinking of like ayahuasca or DMT. That's where a lot of the push is right now, is
Mm.
to normalize these things, not through a
Yeah.
recreational use. They're taking the same route that marijuana did and using it for a medical use. Is there any valid medical reason to take these kind of substances?
You know, Obviously, I'm speaking from someone with personal experience, not a doctor, obviously. I'm a, I'm inclined to say no. And most of the people, I just feel like, so there was a, I think he's a clinical psychologist who's a professor at Wheaton that I talked to, because he's actually planning to write a book on psychedelics. And he was talking about how his opinion, he felt that like low doses of MDMA, which MDMA is not a classic psychedelic, it's not like LSD and psilocybin and DMT in several of its qualities. And I took ecstasy MDMA once, and I thought it was strange because it felt to me more like a happy pill. Like it wasn't like that, you know, adventure and extremes of experience thing that I loved slash hated with LSD. And he said he felt that perhaps low doses of MDMA could facilitate talk therapy. And he's a professor at a Christian college. I don't know if I mentioned that. Wheaton, yeah. And he said though, what's going on, the most of the research that's being done now, and which I've observed, is giving people really high doses, particularly of psilocybin. It seems like psilocybin is the biggest research, you know, substance right now. And he said he thinks, he used this analogy. It was really interesting. He said he felt, you know, MDMA could kind of loosen the bonds of this trauma. He uses hands like this. That's why I'm, you know, through talk therapy. But he said in that case, he felt even in that case, it's the talk therapy that's actually effectuating the change. And he said he felt like with the high doses of psychedelics that the psychologists and the psychiatrists were hoping it's like a just to detonate, you know, kind of like a
Yeah.
scorched earth approach, that they're just going to blow this trauma up. But he said the assumption is that things are going to come back together as they should. But he said, how do you know things aren't going to come back together? You know, like all, sorry for his,
Yeah.
like all twisted and all. And I found that to be true in my experience. And I feel like it took me years, you know, by the grace of God to heal from everything that happened. Granted, you know, I'm sure people will say, well, you took it too much, or, you know, but I don't know, you know, and I've really struggled with that question, and I'm inclined to say no. But at the same time, it is difficult to argue with someone's subjective experience of saying, you know, I was stuck in depression for 20 years and this
Yeah.
helped me. I just don't know that I believe it's a long-term solution to anything. And of course, ultimately, from my perspective as a Christian, I believe, you know, Christ alone is is the long-term solution.
I would feel
Not
like
that
there,
not that,
yeah.
you know, not that God, you know, heals everyone of their depression and anxiety on this, you know, in this life anyway. But yeah, so I've struggled with that question, but I'm inclined to say no. Yeah, I'm inclined to say no.
I would feel like there's also, though there might be a couple of people that say it really benefited from them, I wonder how rarely we hear from those. If you're already going in with trauma and you've
Yeah.
already got things that you're really struggling with,
Yeah.
these could be extremely destructive,
Yeah.
because all your worst fears, all your worst nightmares can
Mhm.
show up. And
Oh
you could
yeah.
be in a good mood, you could be having a great day, and one little thing could take that journey and send it a different way
Oh yeah, for
that
sure.
destroys you for a long time.
Yes.
So I think we
Yes.
often hear from the people who do these kind of experiments often want to show the benefits. And so there might be, I'm not a conspiracy theory guy, but they're not going to
Yeah.
promote the people whose lives have been devastated by it as well.
Right.
They're going to point to the people who have, oh yeah, this really helped me out. And
Right.
there's just so much we don't know about this
Yeah.
stuff. And there's a difference when we're talking about medicine, but I think most people, especially, it's weird, we've become much more of a new age culture. Even the church is
Mhm.
more willing to entertain new age stuff. Some of the things I see from certain charismatic churches,
Yeah.
the people screaming just hysterically on the floor as they flop
Mhm.
around. That to me looks very similar to people that I've seen have really bad acid trips where
Yeah.
there's
Yeah. I
like
could
they
see
have
that.
no control and they're just screaming in pain.
Yeah.
They want to
Yeah.
die, you know, and
Yeah.
somebody's over there like, oh, it's the Holy Spirit. I'm like, that doesn't look like the
Right.
Holy Spirit. That Holy Spirit hurting somebody.
Right.
But it seems we're much more open to new age stuff, even within the church. And I think we have to be really careful
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
Now, before we
Yeah.
started recording, we were talking about how the church might have handled this stuff in the 60s when psychedelics and things like that were very big.
Yeah.
But I think the way the church handled it might not have been beneficial, because
Mm.
it was more just what was that? The marijuana propaganda from back in the day, where if you smoke this, you're going to go insane, right? Like it
Oh,
was so,
reefer
yeah,
madness.
Reefer
Yeah.
Madness. Yeah, the old movie Reefer
Right.
Madness. That we
Yeah.
might have done some of that. And so
Yeah.
people just
I
lost
could see that.
trust in us. So I think
Yeah.
it's good that we have these conversations now for
Yeah.
people that are psychedelically curious to say, look, we
Right.
understand why you're curious, but don't. It's not healthy. What
Right.
you said, so your last time on mushrooms about 8 years ago didn't go well. Is that why you
No.
became a Christian? Kind of explain the transition for me.
Um, there were, I feel like, several different threads, that God was pulling at the time, and the psychedelics were certainly part of it. I just had clung to them for so long as my primary. They really were my primary spirituality. I mean, I had yoga on the side. I was very devoted to yoga and different strains of yoga philosophy, and kind of into Hinduism, Buddhism, light, like I said, just kind of a grab bag of
The
whatever.
the universe, the
Yes, of
universal gift.
course.
Yeah, which means
Yeah,
nothing. It's such a blanket term.
which I'm very fascinated by that. As an aside, I'm very fascinated by that because I think you when I hear people say that, I think, well, you're just attributing characteristics of God to the universe. So you're still deifying you're deifying creation. It's just really fascinating to me how and I feel like I've heard people talk that way too about the mushroom. Like the mushroom showed me this, like the mushroom, or LSD. Like LSD showed me, LSD gave me this insight. LSD, and it's really interesting.
The same
Um,
thing when people say I'm spiritual but not religious. So I'm very
right,
spiritual. I was like, well,
yeah,
Charles Manson was spiritual.
right. Oh yeah,
So
yeah,
you're going to have to define your terms, because that could mean, I'm a devil worshiper, right? Like just saying
right,
you're spiritual, but it's said in a positive way. Well, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. Like it's more
right,
open, which I think
right.
it just means I haven't thought through any of this. I just like the words.
Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I like the idea, and I would have said that back in the day because I
Yeah.
like the idea of there being a vague something, but at the same time, I didn't want to be accountable to, I did, it was kind of like having this impersonal God that I just held at arm's length and I, vaguely believe was there. Didn't have any real kind of substantial faith in and wasn't accountable to, didn't have a relationship with, but I just like the idea. Yeah. And by the same principle applies with, like, when we say you can have a psychedelic or a spiritual experience with psychedelics, well, that doesn't mean it's positive. It just means it's a it's
Right.
a spiritual experience. um so yeah, I thought I was just so devoted to psychedelics, and I would have said that I believed in God and this was my pathway to God, but really it was I love the drug, I love the drugs. And so I got to the point where I could not have a good trip on LSD anymore. Try as I might, I just could not have a good trip. And we tried all kinds of different things, and I think I mentioned in the essay or in the podcast that I actually met my husband at our acid dealer's house, which is always an interesting story to tell, in church
Yeah.
circles. And so we were both into it, and we tried different settings. We tried this, and I tried chanting and meditating, and I just could not have a good trip anymore. And so I just got into all kinds of crazy rationalizing about it. And I thought, well, maybe there is something to some people will say, well, LSD is a chemical and psilocybin is natural.
Yeah.
And so I thought, okay, maybe I should just go back to mushrooms because they're natural. How can that be harmful? They're natural. And that will give me a good trip again. And so I decided to grow them. And yeah, and we ate a pretty big dose, and I remember it was like right as soon as I started tripping, as soon as they set in, it was like right back to the same place. And it was interesting that trip. The house we lived in at the time, it had like 2 bedrooms, a Jack and Jill bathroom, and then the living room, and then the kitchen was over here. But you could walk around and like pass through the bedroom, bathroom, bedroom, back through the living room. And I remember my husband was just sitting on the couch, and I was just walking that same, like practically wearing a rut in the floor over and over again. And it was such a profound analogy for what I was doing in life.
Mm.
And I remember I kept feeling like, I kept saying, "Where is God?" And I kept feeling like I was chasing after him, and I would just miss him. Like I would just feel something like whisk around the corner, and it sounds kind of comical, but it was intensely sorrowful at the time. And we actually were going to a Christian church at that time. But I still had one foot firmly planted in the new age psychedelic world, and I hadn't fully surrendered to Jesus at that point. And we also, as I read about in my essay, I also had a good friend from childhood who I had kept in touch with, and we would have she had children too, and so we'd have play dates every so often, and I would spout whatever new age babble I was into, and she would just very gently, in just a very tender way, would counter it by saying, "Well, the Bible says, the Bible says this," and quote something from the Bible, and I would just kind of inwardly roll my eyes, and not. And then she had a let's see, my son and her daughter were about the same age, and her daughter was diagnosed with leukemia. It was just very sudden. Died 3 weeks later. So it was
Mm.
just so fast, so tragic, so sad. And I remember going to her daughter was named Joella, and I remember going to her funeral, and I was definitely at a spiritually desolate point by then. I felt like psychedelics have failed me, but I don't know about this Jesus person. I've just been fighting, fighting this for so long, like avoiding anything to do with Christianity while meanwhile embracing everything else. Yeah, I was just really wrestling with it. But like I said, I was also to this point of desperation. And it was really her witness, I'd say, was really instrumental in that whole, it was like a whole that's how God works. I feel like there were all
Yeah.
these different factors weaving together, and people who were influencing me, and I'm sure my mom was praying for me, had been praying for me for years. So yeah, that's in a nutshell, I guess.
So this journey, and I think I was having a thought while I was listening, and I think if there are benefits that come from psychedelics, if anything, it makes us hungry for the
Mm,
authentic,
yeah.
right? Like
Yeah,
there's the
that's good.
counterfeit, and it's like you
Yes.
took the counterfeit for so long, eventually you get tired of the counterfeit,
Yeah.
and you started to go, okay, but I want more. So
Yeah.
scripture is clear, I think, when it comes to these kind of things. Like it's okay to have a drink, an alcoholic drink, but there
Yeah.
are strict commands that we be sober minded, that we don't
Right.
allow these things to control us, that we don't be mastered by anything.
Yeah.
And as soon as you take a psychedelic, you lose sober mindedness.
Yeah.
There's not, there's not just like, oh, I'm just going to have a little bit. It's going to have an effect that impairs your judgment in some sense.
Yeah.
And if we live in a supernatural world where I can open a door and allow God into my life, then wouldn't
Yeah.
it make sense that I could open a door and allow other things into my life?
Yeah, for
Uh,
sure.
there was a
Yeah.
book, I think I have it up here somewhere, I read many years ago, and I don't really recommend it. So even if I say it, don't go out and buy it. But it's called When Pigs Move In,
Hmm.
and it's about the guy who was demon possessed and about how possession happens and the things that
Oh,
we allow
okay.
into our life. It's a
Yeah.
little out there, and I don't recommend the things it prescribes to deal with stuff, but
Okay.
it is the idea that, hey, we can open the door to anything.
Mhm.
Like we might be physical and we might live in a physical world, but at the same time, there's an aspect of us that is beyond the natural. Call it our consciousness, call it our
Yeah.
soul, whatever it is. There
Yeah.
is an aspect of us that exists in a realm that is more than just the natural. And we have to be
Yes.
careful what doors outside of the natural we open and let into our lives, because we don't
Yeah.
know how that's going to affect us in the long term.
Absolutely. Yeah.
When you
Yeah, for
became a
sure.
Christian, did you have to deal with any of the stuff emotionally or mentally that you had experienced and saw during those
Oh,
times?
yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I feel like, and that's why it's fascinating to me, this, movement to use psychedelics as a treatment for anxiety and depression, because I feel like, granted, I did have issues with panic and anxiety when I was a child, just not all the time, but just episodic. But I suspect that psychedelics greatly exacerbated all of that. And I actually, gosh, like 6 months after I discovered LSD and took it for the first time, and it was like I said at that time, it was readily available through some friends of mine, and I took it probably twice a week, 3 times a week, and sometimes I would microdose, but then like Friday or Saturday night was usually my big dose night, and I was just getting so far out there. It's ironic because I think you can feel like you're really getting somewhere spiritually and like you're like right on the verge of some great revelation and discovery. And yet at the same time, I felt like I was becoming further and further alienated from actual reality and from the people around me and I couldn't explain to people what I was experiencing, but I felt like I had constructed this entire fantasy world around things that I would see and things that I would experience on psychedelics. And anyway, all of that to say, I completely broke down and voluntarily checked into a mental institution for a week. But I convinced myself at that time that it wasn't the LSD. It was something else. It wasn't that. So it was like the day after I got out, I took LSD again, and I look back and think, wow, that was foolish. But it was almost like I had this, I don't know, like a Stockholm syndrome with it, where I felt I was enslaved to it, but I believed that it was saving me. I believed that it was sanctifying me, to use Christian language. And
It
yeah,
becomes an
yeah.
addiction, even
Oh
though they
yeah, for
say
sure.
it's not chemically anything that makes you feel good to some degree or
Yes.
another, or even anything that disrupts what you are normally doing, right? Like
Yes.
anything that changes perspective or can change a mood, anything that impairs judgment
Yeah,
can be addicting. And so
absolutely.
when people say
Yeah.
pot's not addicting, I'm like, I know people who have had a really hard time
Oh yeah.
quitting.
Yeah,
Like,
for
so there's
sure.
lots of things.
For sure.
Sugar is addicting, right?
Yes.
Our lives are surrounded by things that are addicting.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, it's interesting that you go to get this mental help and your first thought isn't maybe I should stop taking psychoactive drugs
Right.
that rearrange my brain chemicals, right?
No,
Um,
yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. It was, I think psychedelics, and people, like you said, people love to say that they're not addictive, and they're not addictive by the same mechanism, that I would think. I've actually never tried heroin or cocaine, thank God. But I was into speed at the same time I was into psychedelics. I wouldn't take them together, but speed would always be like my next day drug, so I could spend hours and hours drawing or writing, things that just didn't make sense at all. But so I don't think they're addictive. Psychedelics are addictive by the same mechanism. Like you don't have physical withdrawal, you don't have physical craving. Yet I feel like they can be intensely psychologically addictive. And it was interesting. I read in one of the studies that I was able to read. I wish that I, had like an academic pass so I could read the entirety of all these studies, but some of them are available online. And one of the subjects for one of the Johns Hopkins depression studies, he said with psilocybin, he said that for gosh, like 6 to 12 months afterward, he did feel so much better. And his depression that he had been living under for, 15 years had alleviated. But now, a year or so on, he was back in the same place. And he said, oh, I really wish that I could do it again, but it's not available to me. So I look at that and think like there absolutely is, like you said, anything is that we can take that is changing our consciousness, that is changing our normative reality, I think can be addictive. And it's interesting. I was going to say earlier, Ram Dass, who I'm sure you've probably heard of, he was originally Richard Alpert. He was one of the professors at Harvard in the 60s who, alongside Timothy Leary, actually ended up getting kicked out of Harvard because um, of this experiment, the Good Friday experiment he did, among other things. And he said that, and I look back and think, wow, but he said that he believed that LSD was the second coming of Christ, and which I was like, oh, sure, that makes sense. And he said, because God knew that Americans needed something material, so he gave us something material. And obviously, I no longer believe that LSD is the second coming
yeah.
of Christ, but I can see what he was saying about the material, the materialism, and like we were talking about earlier, like you can ingest this substance and bam, have a spiritual experience. So I think absolutely it is addictive, if by a different mechanism than other traditional drugs of addiction.
I think I was in high school and I was reading Design for Dying by Timothy Leary. I might got the name of
Okay.
that wrong.
Okay.
Where
Yeah.
as he was dying, he was talking about what was going to happen next, and a lot of it had to do with his psychedelic use.
Yeah.
Um, and so now you've combined kind of your future and your current life with Christ
Uh,
with some of the interesting facets of your past, especially in your art. So
yeah.
you are an artist, and
Yes.
if people go to your website, they can see how there is this very psychedelic. There's a hint of psychedelic, or I don't know how much you want to say of it is psychedelic, but of that kind of artwork that you combine. And I thought that was really interesting. I went to art school for several
Oh,
semesters,
okay. Okay.
and it was mushrooms. I wouldn't say is
Mm,
I can't blame it on the mushrooms why I didn't finish.
yeah.
But that was what I spent most of my time doing. It was my lack
Okay.
of self discipline. But I was like,
Yeah.
that was part of the art for me. That was like I was going to see and I could be in touch and understand things that I didn't see before, and I would
Yeah.
infuse that into my artwork. And then the next day, as my mind was cleared up, I'd be like, that's a mess. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't
Yeah.
know what I was thinking. But
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about your artwork and how you combine the two.
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked about that, because that's honestly, that's something that I struggle with a little bit, because people have looked at my artwork and said like, "Whoa, that's trippy," and I was like, well, I don't necessarily want to have that association, or feel like I'm promoting, obviously, don't want to feel like I'm promoting the use of psychedelics. But at the same time, all those geometric patterns, which I love, and I always loved intricate patterns even before I had ever taken psychedelics. Like, I was just always very attracted to intricate patterns. And I think a lot of those patterns, I'm like, well, those belong to God. Like, you can see those in nature. You can see that succulent cacti, you can see these patterns in nature. And so and it's interesting, if I look at the work that I actually produced when I was taking psychedelics, I look back and think, like you said, like, wow, that's a mess. And I don't think I even have anything up on my website that I actually produced when I was actually using psychedelics. And so now I look at it as, and I hope I'm right. And I hope that it's okay that I still use some of those elements, and the bright colors, and I just love, and I look at it as psychedelics did shape who I am. They just did, because they were a huge part of my life for 8 years, or yeah, at least 6 or 7 years. And I look at it as, God working all things for our good. And I feel like there are elements of it that aren't even necessarily exclusive to the psychedelic experience, that God has, you know, I guess, drawn from my experience and is now using for his good and his glory. Because I do make sure now, with every piece that I make, that it's pretty explicitly Christian. Like,
Yeah.
I'll usually have scripture in it, I'll have crosses in it, I'll have, and the other, another aspect of that too is like, well, I wonder if one thing I was going to say earlier, I think it is important for people like you and people like me to be speaking about this, because we have actual experience. If a Christian comes along, and I'm not saying that Christians shouldn't, caution people about drugs, but I just know, I'm sorry, we just got a new
You're
puppy
okay.
and he's being very loud.
Yes.
Um, and I would have, back in the day, I would not have listened to someone who had not actually taken psychedelics, because I'd
Yeah.
be like, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You've never taken them. And so I think with my artwork, like, well, perhaps if that can catch someone's attention, who's immersed in that entire world, and they look at it more closely and they say, wait a second, why is there scripture in this? Why is there, then hopefully that could be, I don't know, like maybe an evangelistic tool. But I'm glad you asked that, because I have struggled with, oh, should I tone this down? Should I make
No,
this look less trippy? But at the same time, that the bright colors and geometric patterns, it's just what I'm attracted to
Yeah,
artistically. And I, yeah.
it's not like druggies have ownership of certain patterns and colors and we
Right.
can't use them.
Yeah,
So what
exactly.
I've
Yeah.
always believed is we worship the God of all creativity, yet Christians are sometimes the most uncreative people.
Yeah.
So I think it's
Sadly.
good. I'm encouraged when I see creativity from a
Yeah.
Christian. And I
Yeah.
don't think we need to be worried about, oh, I wonder if, they don't have
Yeah.
ownership of that. Well,
Yeah.
Ashley, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
It answered some questions for me. I just kind of was curious on this, and so I really appreciate you taking your time to answer some of these questions. If people want to read, I'm going to leave a link to the article that you wrote, which was very well written.
Thank you.
But if they want to know more about you, where can they go? Give your address to your website.
Okay. Yeah, it's just www.ashleylande.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much,
Okay.
Ashley. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.